fit for what Itaú had already been doing in their own internal operations. They were one of the 10 charter founding members, and they serve on the steering committee today. One of the key takeaways that we had from our interview with Banco Itaú is, besides just applying the social and environmental risk criteria to projects of $10 million and above, they've gone beyond that. They've applied it beyond project financing. They've actually developed a social and environmental credit risk policy and profile for every single client with $3 million of assets and above. This includes small businesses and large corporations as well. And they use this profile and their past performance in all their decision-making processes, right down to investment banking. We went over to Banco Galicia in Argentina. They're smaller in size and scope, but they also have this tremendous sense of responsibility for protecting their natural resources and assets as well. They adopted in 2006. One of the main takeaways we had from them is they've developed this proprietary environmental risk indexing software. It sounds a little complicated, it actually is, but what they've done is taken a number of indices, they apply a value to it, and they create this sort of risk ratios depending on the project's potential to have adverse negative impacts. And then they use this very on in the planning process with the client to work together with the client to come up with mitigation strategies, to come up with contingencies for the project financing. Again, hedging themselves against financial risk. But one of the key things we found with both Argentina and Banco Itaú is this overall desire to work with the clients. That the Equator Principles is not to screen out projects, but actually work together with them to together see the projects be successful.
So next we move to Corpbanca in Chile. So a couple of interesting items about Corpbanca. So first of all, they apply the Equator Principles to all of their project financing decisions, regardless of project size or dollar amount. They completely ignore the $10 million threshold. Secondly, they've already identified in the past where they haven't managed environmental risk successfully and have lost money. They had a construction project several years ago. Some toxic waste was dumped into a vacant lot. The project was shut down, and the project was closed, and the loan not repaid. So a significant loss to Corpbanca. So this is something that they see as key to their financial risk mitigation and something very important to their success as a business, and also a competitive advantage, them being the only bank in Chile to have currently adopted the Equator Principles. Moving on to Uruguay, we have Banco República, which is unique among the banks that we spoke to, as they're the only state-owned bank that we spoke to. As a result, by law, they're accountable for 50% of the credit market in Uruguay, and those typically tend to be the larger projects. So with just this one bank having adopted the Equator Principles, we're pretty much covering all qualifiable project financing to be subject to the Equator Principle guidelines in Uruguay.
So what can we take away from all of this? Well, there's a number of conclusions we can draw, and it's first important to point out that this was exploratory research. Very little has been published and researched in light of this. So, and it's also fairly new. So for us to go down to South America and sit face to face with these people who were actually going through the process was a privilege for us, and we were able to draw some valuable conclusions, both from our primary interviews and what little there is published. But the biggest thing is, aside from the feel-good of thinking that you're doing the right thing, it makes sound financial sense. If you think of yourself from the bank's perspective, and you're going to finance a project that could have potential to pollute, for example, well, fines could be levied against the company. Lawsuits could emerge as a result of your pollution. If pollution is on the property and that property was put up for collateral as part of the loan agreement, that's going to affect the value of credit you have. So this is hedging yourself in sound financial advice to hedge yourself against potential risk. But there's also reputational risk, especially in South America. There's such a growing awareness of global warming and climate change and the effects on this, not only on the agricultural crops, but around the world. And customers and businesses are looking for businesses that understand what they call the triple bottom line: people, planets, and profits. They're looking to spend money with their companies. They're looking to put their money in. There's socially responsible investment opportunities, and foreign investors from around the world are looking at companies, banks, and projects that are taking social and environmental criteria into account. There was a study published in Business Week a few months back. They did a survey, and SRI indices are actually performing their counterparts in 9 of different 13 categories. It was a study done by Morningstar, so it just further evidences that this is it's a growing area. One of the things that we found, however, is just the tremendous commitment. It was so impressive, not only with the adoption, training, and implementation, the amount of money that you have to spend, the training, the sheer organizational shift that you go through to adopt to this, but actually complying the projects with the Equator Principles. Give you a perfect example. Banco Galicia made a large loan to an agricultural client. They went to plant lemon trees. As part of the Equator Principles follow-up, they conduct an on-site visit. The clients planted soybeans. Well, soybeans has a much higher profit margin, but it also comes down to issues of soil erosion, of hydrology, of the slope of the land. In California, it's simple. You go to the Environmental Protection Agency. Is this project zoned for this? Yes or no. The EPA gives you a red light or green light, and then you sign off on the loan or you don't. But it's a lot more complicated. So that's just an example of the responsibility that banks take on their own shoulders when there's a lack of enforcement or government accountability in enacting these principles. So, some of the recommendations as the Equator Principles moves forward into its next phase. First and foremost, we discovered a lack of standardization with training materials, with implementation, and with reporting. With 4 different consulting companies authorized to help businesses enact the Equator Principles, there's 4 different ways of doing things. But most interesting was in the reporting. It's impossible for me as a client to sit down and compare Bank A to Bank B and their performance the way I would an annual report or a balance sheet. It just simply doesn't exist. There also needs to be a level enforcement. Right now, the Equator Principles is voluntary. It's a self-governing body. And unless and until it has the ability to enforce, to fact check, to issue sanctions, to possibly ask a bank to leave the Equator Principles, the cachet and the value of attaching the Equator Principles logo and name as a signature project to a bank or specific project or to a client, it's not going to be able to grow. You need to also keep the adoption process simple. It needs to welcome new banks who might not have the financial resources. It also needs to not have levels of bureaucracy to be intimidating for existing clients. And lastly, it needs to expand the scope. The Equator Principles were designed for emerging markets. This has to do with areas like Africa, Middle East, China, Southeast Asia. These are new horizons for the Equator Principles where there's not much transparency, where social and environmental risk factors are not given much consideration by the governments. The responsibility comes to the banks. And last but not least, it needs to fall also and grow beyond project financing. There's a tremendous value, and it's shown that you can be profitable and protect the environment and protect the people with which you serve by taking social and environmental risks into account, regardless of project financing, but also in other areas of your business operations. It's been a pleasure to work on this topic. We welcome any questions before or after. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.